We've seen that from Marx in the first part of the Communist Manifesto. The bourgeoisie is the revolutionary class that sweeps away the entire old world and produces a new social world in which human beings live in industrial society. And the main class conflict ends up being one of the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, because the proletariat is brought into existence as such by the processes that the bourgeoisie uses in order to attain its dominance over the earlier classes within society. Now, Marx and Engels think that the bourgeoisie, in creating the proletariat, in creating the conditions in which they live, and not fixing that along the way, and they don't think that the bourgeoisie could actually fix that anyway, have generated their own, as they call them, grave diggers. So the idea is that something is going to happen, but it's not going to happen right away. As a matter of fact, the Communist Party that this is the manifesto for is engaged in this long generation after generation process of trying to increase what they call class consciousness and to chart out and make clear for the proletariat what has been happening to them. Now, one thing I do want to point out before we go into this, that Marx thinks is, and Marx and Engels think is really a major contribution made by bourgeois society, and especially the industrial modes of production, is that what they've done is they've peeled off the mask. They've unveiled the relations that really exist between human beings, the things that are the most determinative. So, you know, the earlier modes of interaction, which were guided by, say, courtesy or privilege for the nobles, those are taken away. And what's substituted for them is what he calls the cash, or value nexus. People are evaluated in terms of what can they actually provide, what can they contribute, what property, what income do they have, what prospects, what can they produce for one or for society. Now, there's a number of conditions that are going to gradually change the condition of the proletariat and turn them into a very large and a very dangerous class. So we want to look at what's going on in all of this. So a sort of centralization, a sort of standardization of society is going to go on. And what else is going to happen? In industrial society, I mean, think about how far this has gone along today. There's increasing use of machines. So if we think about weaving, what's required in order to produce modern clothing, originally you had people working in textile mills, and they would take, for example, cotton. Cotton would come from various places, including Egypt, also the United States eventually, and the cotton would be turned into thread first, and then the thread had to be woven, and they had this lattice work, this immense machines for weaving it. This, for example, this isn't cotton, I don't think, but it's woven. You can see the fabric there, the weave. Then, there would be other processes down the line. Seamstresses would cut the cloth up and make it into clothing. Then you have somebody who'd sell the clothing wholesale, and then eventually it gets to the retailers, and then the person buys it and wears it. These incredible processes. Now think about what it's like today. How far industrial manufacturing has gone. We've introduced way more machines. So if there is a proletariat today, they would be in a even more mechanized, alienated condition, according to Marx, wouldn't they? We have machines that can actually make machines or run other machines. We have managed to mechanize and thereby standardize the processes. As he says, what happens is the people who are engaged in these sort of work cease to enjoy their work. They cease to identify with it. Here we go. Owing to the extensive use of machinery and the division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character. Think, for example, when you're writing a report in say, this class, and I say, tell me what Marx is saying here, there's still something of you involved in it. It's you that's being graded. It's your writing. Now imagine that you were part of a paper mill. And when I say paper mill, I don't mean the one, the old-fashioned paper mills that generate reams of paper. I mean these places where you can buy term papers from, where the people just churn them out and churn them out and churn them out. When you're doing that sort of thing, it's kind of alienating. It no longer feels like it's your work, because it's not your work. You're selling it to somebody else, and they present it as their own. So he says, it's lost all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine. And it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. So what's going on there? There's a lack of what we nowadays call job satisfaction. And this is the case, isn't it, for a lot of the work that we do. I've worked a lot of jobs where I wasn't particularly happy with what I was doing, and I felt that my talents weren't being adequately used, but I needed the money. And that's the situation that the proletariat are in. The more that you do those kind of jobs over and over and over again, the more your horizons begin to shrink to where you say, well, maybe I am just this. Maybe this is all there is for me. The reduction of the person to the labor that they can provide. That's the only value that the proletariats are given socially. What they can actually provide, what they can get paid for doing. This leads us to talking about the exploitation of surplus value. This is a central Marxist concept. So he talks about this by saying the cost of production of a workman, is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for maintenance and for the propagation of the race. Now, what does that mean, and why would that be the case? What we're saying there is that all you actually need to pay a work person is enough so that he can feed himself and whoever else is dependent upon him and provide. He doesn't have to have a house, he can have an apartment. If he needs a car to get to work, enough that he can actually have a car and insurance, and we can multiply these sorts of things. The basic idea is that there's some sort of minimum wage, and that minimum wage is not set by government, for example, but is set by saying, what is the minimum that I need to pay this guy to get him to show up to work and do the work that I want so that I have the product? Now, where does the rest of the money go? Well, that's what we call surplus value. I'll use an example from when I used to work in a pizza restaurant. So back then, minimum wage was $3.35 an hour, and I started out at minimum wage. And I would make pizzas at this pizza restaurant, and I probably could make, and bake at least, say, 20 pizzas an hour. Each pizza sold for more than $3.35. Each pizza sold for $5 or $6. Now, you could say, well, there's the cost of, raw materials and there's the building and all that sort of stuff. And that's true. The person who's outlaying the expense for providing the basic materials, the tools, the location, who's built up goodwill among customers, there is something there, right? Marx is perfectly fine with recognizing that. But it doesn't add up to that much money. And I remember one time one of the assistant managers showing me the books for that place. Payroll for the entire place was 20% of the gross. 40% of the gross was pure profit. That's what we call surplus value. The people who own the means of production and hire proletariats to engage in wage labor are using their labor, say 8 hours a day, and they're paying them in product, in money, just this little portion over here, while they appropriate to themselves, they exploit them, they appropriate to themselves the lion's share, even when we're accounting for other things, losses, cost of doing business, all these insurance, all these other things. There's still this profit over here that they are then appropriating. Now, if this goes on and on and on and on, what happens? Those who engage in wage labor don't make any money. They're stuck doing it the rest of their lives. in the absence of something like a pension or Social Security, they'll do it till they die, or if they can't work, and then they'll die because of that, because they have no money. Whereas the rich, the bourgeoisie, the ones who own the means of production, they're constantly making more and more and more money. So what does this mean? In an economy where that's happening, there's a disequalization that's taking place. The rich are becoming richer, but now they're rich in comparison to the workers, and the workers actually are they have less ability to buy things because they're all within the same marketplace. So the lives of the workers become worse and worse and worse, economically, socially, in whatever other measure that you want to have. And those who have the wherewithal, who have what Marx and Engels call capital, who own the means of production, become better and better. The competition that a capitalist marketplace entails also requires the impoverishment of the worker. You might say, well, no, shouldn't that keep costs down for the worker? Yes, it does to a certain extent, so that's a benefit. At the same time, the manufacturers are impelled to make things as cheaply as possible. And so that means they want to pay as little as possible because they want to be able to compete against that other manufacturer over there who might offer even cheaper product, and then who is going to get the lion's share of the market share. This is going to lead, Marx says, to economic crises. And these economic crises are a major problem. He talks about these. Where is that? He talks about here we go. Epidemics of overproduction. And this happens every so often. Society finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? And here's the paradoxical thing. Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. Instead, they endanger it. Why? Because they create a whole bunch of people who are out of work and who are saying, what am I going to do? I don't have anything. I've got to feed myself. I may have some kids to feed as well. And that guy over there is doing pretty good. I'm going to go beg him. If he doesn't give me something, I'm going to rob him. And so these economic crises produce some incredible disequilibrium. They produce a lot of societal disorder, instability. And that is the condition that the proletariat lives in. As Marx is going to put it, what's happening is the proletariat is having revealed to him or to her the actual condition of human beings when we strip away all of the finery, all of the ideology, all of the mumbo-jumbo of bourgeois morality. He says that what happens is, here we go, in the condition of the proletariat, those of the old society at large are already virtually swamped. The proletariat is without property. He lacks any sort of ownership. His relation to his wife and children no longer has anything in common with bourgeois family relations. As a matter of fact, we could switch it around and say the relationship of a proletariat has nothing in common. The relation of a proletariat to her husband and children has nothing in common with bourgeois family relations either. There's all this lip service that's made to the importance of children and taking care of them and parenthood and motherhood. But if you have to work, you have to work. If daycare isn't available, what do? The proletariat families bear the brunt of what's going on in society. Law morality, religion are to the proletariat so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. So what's going on is the bourgeoisie, by impoverishing the proletariat, by placing them in this situation where it's getting worse and worse and worse for them, are in fact producing their own gravediggers. They're producing people who have nothing to lose by changing the order of society. Nothing to lose by abolishing bourgeois conceptions of property, ownership, and production. So what we want to look at now is the development of what we call class consciousness. The awareness of how things actually are, who you should be in solidarity with, who you should be opposed to, what you should value and what you shouldn't. And Marx says this has to develop over time as well. There's a historical process. At first, the proletariat actually have the wrong targets. They have the wrong targets in two different stages. They attack the instruments of production. So he has examples here of weavers who had woven by hand, seeing these looms and going and attacking them and saying, we're going to destroy these. The Luddites, for example, were early destroyers of machinery. And he says, they destroy imported wares which compete with their labor. They smash to pieces machinery. They set factories ablaze. What are they trying to do? They're trying to restore by force the vanished status of the work person, who was, not high up, but at least had some relative independence and status in the Middle Ages. But the Middle Ages are gone. That's not going to work. Industrial society is what's here to stay. Meanwhile, the bourgeoisie enlists the proletariat in its own class struggles. So this is going to be very important. He says, when the workers actually get together to form bodies, it's not the consequence of their own active union, but the union of the bourgeoisie, which is trying to attain its own political ends, and it enlists the workers, it enlists the proletariat on its side. So the proletarians do not fight their enemies, he says, but the enemies of their enemies. The remnants of absolute monarchy, the landowners, the non-industrial bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie, they're all enemies of the bourgeoisie who wants to radicalize everything, but then keep things at that point. And the proletariat doesn't really realize that they're not helping themselves out by doing this. They're actually making things worse. It's sort of like if you were working at one of these big box stores, and the owners and the management say, we're under attack from the local government. We need all of you to go and protest outside City Hall. It might not be the workers' interest to do that. As a matter of fact, the workers might be getting screwed. Maybe the best thing for the workers to do would be to line up with City Hall against their management and ownership. But they don't do that at first. But in the process of engaging in this fight, they begin to acquire some of the intellectual tools. They begin to acquire some of the consciousness of their own agency, of their own ability to do something. And the next step is actual development of their own unions. They begin to say, forget it. We don't need the bourgeoisie. Let's get together ourselves. So he says, with the development of industry, the proletariat increases in number, but it becomes concentrated in greater masses. Its strength grows, and it feels that strength. It's becoming conscious of its strength. So growing competition among the bourgeoisie brings about commercial crises, and the workers then begin to say, we need to do something more rational. The management, the owners, they don't care about us. When things all go to hell, they're fine in their house on the hill. We're the ones who are suffering. Let's get together and make sure that things actually go the way that they're supposed to go. And so we see the development of trade unions, and then fairly soon after that, organization into a political party or political parties. They're engaging in the political process now and trying to have a say in their own destiny and how things go. Now, as this goes on, there's going to be some what we can call defectations from the bourgeoisie. Some of these are involuntary. These processes of industrial transformation are going to take some of the people from the bourgeoisie and turn them into losers in the great game, and they're going to fall from their high status of, say, owners or manufacturers down into the bourgeoisie. Same thing is going to happen with some of the other classes as well. More and more people are going to get added to it. Now, those people tend to be fairly well educated, and they also tend to have habits of regarding themselves as possessing a certain degree of dignity or agency, and they contribute. They when they become part of the proletariat, when they become poor, they can do an organizing role, and this actually has a very important part in revolutionary struggles. He also talks about a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class. Why do they do that? Because they see that the revolutionary class has, as Marx and Engels are saying, the future in its hands. They want to line themselves up with where history is going. So some of the bourgeoisie leave. Just as much as in the French Revolution, one of the ways that was able to happen is some of the aristocracy joined the side of the bourgeoisie. The French Revolution was a bourgeois rebellion, by the way, or a revolution. Now, where do we go to? He talks about the awareness, and here's where the class consciousness is ultimately going, the awareness of the illegitimacy of the bourgeoisie. The fact that the bourgeoisie is, as he says, not fit to run society. Why? Well, because it's generated a lot of wealth, it's actually created vast opportunities, but it's also made the condition for many people worse. And if we're going to say who should run society, how should society be structured, which is a political question as well as an economic question, the answer has got to be those who are going to take care of us, those who are going to make conditions better. The bourgeoisie have shown that they can't provide that, according to Marx. So he says, all other historical movements were movements of minorities. This is actually the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority, in the interest of the immense majority. The proletariat cannot raise itself up without the whole strata of official society being knocked aside, being sprung into the air. So what do we need in this case? And this is the Marxist response to this. This is where, if you've been following along so far, you might say, here's where I differ, because a lot of socialists actually did, is revolution. That's the only thing that is going to change these conditions. That's going to elevate mankind out of this dog-eat-dog existence that the bourgeois have led people into. So he says, the bourgeois is unfit to rule because it's incompetent to assure an existence to its slave within his slavery. It cannot help letting him sink into such a state. It has to feed him instead of being fed by him. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society. Another thing that you could say here is, instead of society, humanity. Marx and Engels think that there's a lot to be said on the part of the bourgeoisie for what they've done. They've opened up people's eyes. They've swept away the previous inequalities and, traditional modes of imposing power on people. They've managed to create vast wealth, but they haven't delivered on what they ought to do, and so now it's time for them to get out of the way, and if they won't get out of the way, they have to be swept out of the way.